Okay, let's start. If everybody's ready. So my name is Slava Tikhanov. I'm from Dansk. We are an institution from Netherlands. I'm Ukrainian and I was born in Kyiv. However, I live in Netherlands for last, well, almost 11 years. And today we're going to participate in this nice session on tools, curation, and metadata. So our first speaker is Matthew Dunlap. And Matthew joined Odom Institute in 2019 and has experience developing Dataverse for Dataverse at Harvard IQSS. Now he leads development of on Core 2, right? A Django to assist data curation and verification by encapsulating research data code and allowing this content to be run through various curation workflows. So Matthew, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. Let me get my screen share going. Y'all can see this? I'm assuming you can see it.
Yeah.
Cool. So I'm going to present to you on Core 2, which is a confirmable, reproducible research environment. As Slava graciously described, I'm a software developer at the Odom Institute at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So there's some problems with science data. Data and code are not usually verified before publication. Current workflows for curation and verification require many manual steps, if workflows are even used. And authors almost never run their code outside their own environment. Environments have always been created manually by tech staff, and communication takes place through email. There's like, even when you're trying to do these workflows, there's a lot of manual work that needs to happen. So anyways, we have a solution. It's Core 2. It's an open source, web-based data curation environment, supports complex workflows, deposits data and notebook info into Dataverse at the end of the process. And it manages containerized notebooks via Wholetail. So scientists and curators can work with the same environment setups. If you haven't heard about Wholetail, it's a web application and container managing environment specifically for science data and code. It's built on top of Repo to Docker, which is a great open source library, but also with expanded environment support, full user accounts, API integration. They're a great project, and we rely on them heavily for the container part of our tool. Okay, so this is our main data curation workflow. If you saw our presentation last year or the one 2 years ago, this diagram may be familiar. So I'm going to go over this really quickly. We start with an editor, and this is like a very simplified version of this workflow. There's more steps, but an editor creates a new manuscript entry for curation. Then the author adds their data and code as a submission for review. After the editor looks it over quickly, the curator reviews the submission, checking for presence of files and metadata. The curators in our process are like the managers of this whole process as well. And if the curators approve it, it gets handed to the verifiers to actually run the data and code. And if this all works, it's approved, but usually there's multiple steps for this, or multiple rounds. So with that in place, I'm going to present to y'all a few, talk over a few videos about this. This was better than me trying to live demo because there's like 4 different browser sessions for 4 different users, and doing that as a live demo, plus some of this time it just takes to launch environments, is just infeasible. So we're going to show you, I'll show you this video and talk over it. So we start with our editor, who logs into our application. They're already logged in. And the first thing they do is to create a new manuscript entry. They enter the information about the manuscript, as well as the main author and any exemptions about the process. The next thing they do is they add their manuscript and appendice files for the curation team to use. And lastly, they choose the author who will actually work in Core 2. This goes kind of quick, but for the sake of time, that's what we got to do. The next thing is the author gets an email. seeing that they've been added to this. And there's emails throughout, but we're just going to show you one email. And they click this, they go to their manuscript, and they create a new submission of their data and code. They enter additional metadata in this, including environment info, things that the curation team needs and will later be stored in Dataverse. After that, they go and they upload their data and code files. They could select these through a file picker, or they can drag the files in. You can see that the author forgot to add their README file, and this will be a problem for them in a minute. They've made a mistake, which is really common. We almost always have multiple rounds of submissions. So this container is created in Wholetail. That was definitely sped up. But we connect to Wholetail and create this containerized environment. And as you can see, we now have a container in Wholetail embedded into Core 2. It has the data and the code. I'm not going to run any of this here, but you can see that they have an R environment now. And the author can run their code in another system. Last, they're able to enter info about things that have changed, but this is their first submission, so there's no info for them to add. So now that they've submitted this, we hand this, the editor is informed that there is a submission that needs to be approved before handing to the curation team. And they do a quick look over. They always look over things before the curation team gets it. The editor thinks everything is okay, even though the README is missing. So it gets passed on to our curator, who sees that there is a manuscript that they're not assigned to, but that is ready to be worked on. The first thing they need to do is they need to explicitly assign themselves and a verifier to this manuscript. Even though they can see it, they need to assign themselves so we can keep track of who's working on what. So they add themselves as a curator on this manuscript and add the verifier as a verifier. And now they go to review this. The easiest way for review to happen currently is that you have two pages open, one with the files. A lot of our interactions currently are based around using multiple windows, but we hope to improve that. So as kind of a simplified way, the curator looks over the files on one page while having their review open on another page. And they notice that the README file is not present. Because of this, they need to reject the submission, and the author will need to work on it again. They need to provide us this additional info for us to move forward. So at this point, the manuscript would be handed back to the editor and then to the author. I'm not going to show this whole repeated process here for the sake of time. So the next video I want to show you is what would, sorry about that. So now let me show you what will happen once the manuscript is approved by the curator. In this video, the verifier has already tested the data and code in their own container, launched by Core 2 and Wholetail, which I didn't show. It's the same container environment as the authors. Well, it's not actually the same, it's a different container, but it's the same type of container environment. It's all through Wholetail. So the verifier goes and does their review, and they've run the code and data. It all does what they expect. The curator has already approved this as well. So it's done. And the next step is we need to upload this to Dataverse. So Core 2 handles this. You enter your installation and your parent Dataverse that the new data set will be created in. You can approve the metadata, change the metadata one more time before pushing it off, and also review the files. And if any file changes, last minute file changes need to happen, those can happen as well. Core 2 uploads this to Dataverse, which I definitely sped up some. It's pretty small, but it still takes a little longer. And now that this has been pushed, we're not actually done because we need information from Dataverse for our reporting and to send a report to the editor. So we go into Dataverse we can see this new data set has been created. The curator can add additional metadata, some of which will be pulled into Core 2. I'm not going to show that here, but we pull some of this metadata back. And so they publish it, and you need to publish it for our process to continue, because we enforce that. So now that this data set has been published, we pull the data set info back into Core 2. The last thing I want to show is the reports that we generate for the editor and the publications we work with. We generate these PDF reports, which have the information about every submission of the process. At the bottom, you can see the data citation pulled from Dataverse. They had entered the article citation, that would be there as well. And lastly, Core 2 sends the report off to the editor, and this manuscript is complete. So that was a whirlwind tour through some of the functionality in Core 2. There's a lot of functionality that I didn't even show, but I just wanted to give everyone a sampling of the system and the functionality in it. So to summarize, it has a robust integration with Wholetail. There's a full workflow implemented for 4 roles. And I didn't show this here, but we also have a workflow variation implemented for just our curators and verifiers to do these reviews internally without interactions with the editor and author. So what's next? Now we are beta testing with our curators and verifiers. The system has been developed for all 4 roles the whole way through, but we're testing with just the curators and verifiers in our modified workflow. And soon this will be adopted into the Odom Institute for curation work. And then after, we're going to start user testing with all 4 of our roles. We want to implement additional workflows moving forward, and we're trying to line some of those up. And there'll be constant work on feature improvements. Anyways, that's it. I just wanted to show this to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. And we have one question from Peter Kerali. So he's asking why the editor starts the process. Is it an author who should publish and start to initiate the process, publishing data?
So with the AJPS workflow, which this is built around, the editor is the one who is directly communicating with the curation team, and they're the ones who indicate that this manuscript needs to be done in this process. So the editor is kind of in front of the author for all of these steps, including this. Going forward, we could definitely implement a version of the workflow where the editor is not in this process. And that's like one that we've definitely thought about, because it's just removing some steps. But for the AJPS workflow, the editor needs to do this. That's why the editor also is doing a review before it gets to the curators. The editors are like, they're supposed to be in the process to look over what the author does before it even gets to us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And second question, can one provide own base Docker instance as option?
Sorry, say that again. I was reading a talk.
Yeah.
And
Can one provide their own Docker base instance as option?
So currently, not easily. I think you could do it. We want to do that. I think you could do that already through Wholetail, but we haven't quite integrated that into our workflow. But we would like to do that. We have in political science, it's so rare for anyone to have that level of technical experience that we haven't handled it. But it's not hard. That wouldn't be hard to do in our system. It's the infrastructure is already there.
Okay, thank you. And last question from Sherry. So is the editor of the journal?
Yes, the editor is the editor of the journal.
Okay, clear.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't fully clear about that. Good question, Sherry.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Matthew.
Yes.
So we are moving to our next speaker. So Sebastian Karcher is Associate Director of the QDR, and he holds PhD in political science and active contributor to several scholarly open source projects, including in particular Zetera. And he oversees site translators, and he does a lot of useful things for Dataverse community. So please, Sebastian.
All right, so I'm here actually in two functions. This presentation, I'm here instead of our wonderful graduate assistant, Michael McCall, who is out sick and who developed a tool called DV Curator Python. And so this is a lightning talk in the form of just a quick demo. So what DV Curator does is it hooks into the Dataverse and into the GitHub APIs with a very simple graphical user interface that you see here, and automates the steps that we take to initiate the curation process at QDR, which is then tracked via GitHub projects and GitHub issues with lists. And so essentially, once we've done the initial check on a project that it meets our general collection policy, so we expect to move ahead with curation and publication of a project, that's where DV Curator comes in, and it automates a whole number of steps that we used to do manually. And just to quickly demo how that works, and I'm going to be brave or foolish and do a live demo. You put in the relevant info there. So you start with the Dataverse host, and I'm going to show this based on the demo Dataverse. So this is the data projects. You see it's currently unpublished that I'm going to be working quote unquote on. Then you put in the Dataverse API token. This is my demo Dataverse API token. Obviously, never show people your real one. Your GitHub API token. Again, this is a fairly limited one. Also, you can't see the whole thing, so that should be fairly safe. We use a private GitHub repository for this, obviously, but I'm going to put in our an open testing version so that you can look at it. Then you set a folder. We typically have that set as a Dropbox folder where we store project materials during curation for non-sensitive data. And then yeah, I can try that. So unfortunately, the tool itself doesn't work terribly well with standard Zoom because it's a fairly limited GUI, but this is essentially how the tool looks. And I'm going to go out of the magnifier tool because it makes my mouse all jiggery. But this is effectively what you're looking at in terms of GUI. Last thing you do is you take the DOI, so the DOI in this case of the unpublished data project, and again, put it in here. This one goes in there in the format in which it is in the URL, so DOI : and then you need to make sure there is no stray comma here. And then we have various steps. So the first thing is we just pull down the metadata from the Dataverse API, and you see that it's successful by giving me the short title here. And then we do download and extract. What that does is it downloads all the files as a zip file and puts them in a folder. So I'm going to click this, and you can see here, it includes the folder info. I can actually pull this up on my desktop now. So the folder, I think, was curation, and then it names the project file according to the author, and then the name of the data project, and then has the original deposit, the original metadata in case someone changes something, and then extracts it into the folder where our curators actually work. The next thing that I do is click Make GitHub Project. That takes a little longer. And blue circle, hopefully not of death. Just gonna magnify this again a little bit. You see here it creates a project and then it creates a number of issues. You can select which issues it creates here on the left. And then we can look at these issues in the repository in which we created them. So there should be a new project. It's currently creates classic projects. You see this was just created, and then I can look at the project board. I have my to-dos here, and then you see every one of the to-dos. So for example, metadata is a ticket with a number of tasks that we always check for metadata, and then as they are checked by the curator, they get checked off. And we can see there on the project Kanban board how many of the tasks are still open. And one other thing that it conveniently does for us, it does set XMP metadata by our standard format in PDFs in the pre-specified folder that used to be quite tedious to do. And so it saves us a lot of time and also makes sure that we do things in an exactly specified and standardized way, always have the same metadata, and don't forget to download things, make sure we have our project set up all the right way, etc. And it's a nice way to kind of take advantage of the existing APIs to streamline our workflows.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any questions.
Oh, and obviously code is obviously open source and open licensed, and gonna put that in the.
Okay, no questions. So probably you can start your second presentation.
All right, second presentation. And again, I didn't mean to monopolize. So the second presentation, am I still sharing screen now? The second presentation talks a little bit about how we at QDR have made use of the extensibility of Dataverse to make it more suitable for some of the advanced qualitative applications that we use it for. So QDR, for those of you who are not familiar, is a domain repository for qualitative and multi-method social science data. We've been running this on Dataverse since 2017, I believe, and very happy, but we're also always kind of trying to push. Obviously, Dataverse was developed originally at the Institute for Quantitative Social Sciences, and sometimes it shows. So we are trying to push what can we do that makes it more suitable for qualitative data. So the first thing that we're working on is on archiving QDAS data. QDAS data, or qualitative data analysis software data, is data that qualitative researchers typically or very frequently produce in the course of their research. They use any number of these tools, and they do a number of things in the data. There are typically files in there, then there are memos and codes in there, so like larger notes that researchers write from themselves. Then individual files can be tagged or coded, and then codes can also be applied to excerpts within the files. Right? Imagine you're coding interviews, and right, you're highlighting every section that talks about a specific issue that you're interested in. And then finally, you can actually write notes about those excerpts. So you can, if you find something interesting, just like you would in a PDF document, you could maybe highlight something and you could then write a short note. Oh, this is really interesting, or we need to check back on how this participant talked about this issue, something like this. Depending on the field, I would say somewhere between 40 and 95% of qualitative researchers use those software. And it's obviously really rich data that shows you a lot about how qualitative research is done. So we're quite interested in doing a good job archiving this. The problem is, as you maybe guessed from the beginning, is that early on, the formats, the different tools all had different formats. They were all proprietary. They were all changing, and it was a huge mess. About 3 years ago, most of the major producers got together and agreed on RefiQDAS as an open standard for the exchange of QDAS data between those tools. So all the major players that I showed in the beginning have that implemented. There are two versions here: a very simple XML-based format, QDPC, that just represents the codebook, so what codes are available, in a fairly complex format called QDPX, so the QD project file, that is a zip of all the data files, and then a fairly lengthy XML file that implements all the that describes all the other features in the data. And so what we've started to do is when you upload the file that meets the MIME type, we look into the zip file, we extract the metadata for the XML, and then we use essentially the Dataverse previewer structure that you're familiar with from a bunch of other applications that you've already seen to display that information and allow very basic interaction in a previewer. So to give you a sense, where am I? So this is a test instance. You see here is one of those QDPX files. It has the previewer icon because it has the right MIME type here. I can look at this. It takes a little while to load. And then it shows me the codes. I can look through the various codes that are available. Those are not interactive. And then it lists me the sources within this file. Remember, this is a single file, but I have individual sources here. I could filter them for particular roles. So for example, if I'm interested in a particular code, like context collapse, I think I should be able to just search here. So that's mentioned in 2 transcripts. And then I can actually click on the transcript, I think, and that downloads as, in this case, a text file. So that's currently still somewhat limited in what it can do, but it shows you kind of the potential of being able to explore this complex file that you typically need to load into complex or expensive software before you download it. And it's a really nice way to take advantage of this new format. And that's Jim's work, and Jim is here. So if you have questions about this on the more technical level, which I honestly couldn't answer, he can. The second thing that I briefly want to show is on annotation for a transparent inquiry. This is something that we've been working on for a long time, and that is based on the idea that transparency for qualitative research looks a little different. You often have a researcher writing a text where after every couple of sentences, they make a claim and they base that on an individual source or maybe 2 or 3 sources. And maybe there is some implicit reasoning, analytic reasoning behind that. This contrasts with quantitative research, where the main analytic work happens with in a figure or a table that's produced by some code that you can then deposit for transparency, as Matthew just showed. And so we build ATI to make that process visible. On a technical level, the way this works is we have the authors just create annotated Word or PDF documents, so they don't have to interact with any new technology. Then we convert those documents into W3C compliant open web annotations and then display them using the Hypothesis tool, which is open source software. And then any associated data files. So one of the cool things about ATI is, as we show here, is people can not just write about the sources, but they can actually link to deposited sources in a data depository. So this is a wire from the British Embassy back home to I think their foreign secretary about a meeting in Bangladesh. And so that document is available at QDR. And in addition to the stored data files, we also preserve a JSON copy that holds all the information to recreate the web annotations should that ever be necessary. So we essentially have a preservation copy of the web annotations in QDR. Now that was fairly tedious because it involved a lot of work, and it was also quite transparent for the authors how that entire background process worked. And so what we built was AnnoWrap, which on a functional level takes an annotated docx or PDF document, converts it to a PDF with Hypothesis, so open web annotations, allows users to edit the web annotations, then has a review workflow when we can look at it, and then allows the publication of those annotations to any page anywhere on the web. One of the cool things of web annotations is that they essentially exist as a digital overlay over web pages. So if you have them on one version of a text on place A on the web, if the same text lives somewhere else on the web, you can just quickly copy them over and they're immediately there. And AnnoWrap can do all this. On a technical level, it's an external tool that, as you saw, lives on an external domain. The front end is written as a lightweight Next.js applications that Win coded, and it's a really nice, easy to use tool. Also did some user testing on that, but that was very helpful. And then it talks to a backend API that Jim coded. That does the actual extraction of the annotations from the PDF and doc service doc documents. The documents themselves are stored on Dataverse. So we're not actually creating a separate document store, but are using Dataverse to store any documents that occur in that document. The AnnoWrap, you log into it with Dataverse and Hypothesis API token. And obviously, it relies quite significantly on the Dataverse API. And to quickly get you a sense how this looks, when you get to AnnoWrap as a new user, you get this screen that kind of provides you with a quick run through how does this work. Once you're logged in, you get a screen that shows your existing projects. You can create a new project. If you already have an existing data project on QDR, you can select it here. Then you take a document. So this is a Word document that I'm going to use, and you see there are a couple of comments here on the side. So I'm going to add this document, then create the ATI project. And then once the This should actually be, oh yeah. And then it pulled the annotations from the Word document into the PDF document here. So they're now available here. You can edit them, and you could add new ones. Once you're happy with what you have, you scroll up to the top and you click on Export Annotations. I'm not going to demo that, but you could take those annotations and then copy them. As I said, say you have a preprint version somewhere else, you put the URL here, you select in which group that goes. That could be a private group, or you can just make it into the public open layer, and then you export annotations, and the annotations appear there. All right, there are lots of questions about this.
Oh, thanks. Very interesting. And from my side, I can tell that hypothesis integration is on our roadmap for a long time. And we did some work already. And what you did here is really, it looks great. I would like to, let's collaborate on this, and let's work together. So I think, yeah.
Should I just read questions?
Yeah, please read the question.
Yeah, so we're using the hypothesis service. We thought about this for quite some time, but we decided that not incurring technical debt by deploying our own potentially forked version outweighs the benefits of running our own hypothesis service. The nice thing about this is that there are standard compliance annotations. So if we change our mind, it wouldn't be a huge lift to flip this over to a custom hosted service. But right now, we prefer being able to take advantage of the significant work and leverage that hypothesis is doing, and not, deal with another tool that we need to maintain. We always worry about maintenance costs.
Yeah, but there are some benefits, like if you're running own instance of hypothesis, you can also integrate plugins inside of the page, so you don't need to install it.
Yeah.
So that's quite big thing, I would say.
Yeah. So there is a number of customizability things that we just have no control over. Some appearances, some stuff that hypothesis does that we're not happy with. But remember, right? We're essentially like a 2 to 3 developer shop, and one of them does DevOps, and so I always worry about how we're going to maintain things, and
in principle, it's also possible to integrate with hypothesis code base, because our former chief of technology, Herbert von der Sompel, he was involved in development of the annotation tool. So it's still possible to access simple requests.
So Philip has a whole host of questions. So the zip files, so there's actually 2 competing applications, and we're going to look at the other one right now as an alternative. So what we are currently using is a server-side Java-based application, and then you heard maybe yesterday the Max Planck folks in Germany developed a client-side JavaScript option, and we're just going to look at what works better for us. Yeah, it's really neat for a whole host of ways, right? It's more lightweight because people don't have to download the whole thing. It could be useful to check on things like, have people included formats that we're nervous about in terms of preservation. So lots of benefits. This is the hypothesis that you link to is the open source hypothesis. The code is on GitHub. It's mostly Python, and I think it's also an Apache license. It's a very open license that they develop under, so no restrictions. And it's, other than Dataverse, it's quite tricky to get your own code into Hypothesis. We tried to collaborate with them on some features, and that was painful. So that they're wonderful people, but because of the way the tool is run, we found it hard to collaborate on outside contributed features to Hypothesis. We generally don't believe that the annotations contain highly confidential data, right? You're essentially putting, they contain information that would typically be expected to be publicly visible alongside a publication. The files that they link to can be protected within Dataverse or even outside of Dataverse, but the annotations proper are going to be in eventually publicly visible, essential, kind of like a supplemental data file. So we're not particularly worried about enforcing strong privacy on those annotations. We briefly looked at some other annotation apps, but Hypothesis had the most mature code base and worked best. So I don't know about Pundit. And yeah, so Matthew has kind of the same thoughts on maintainability of locally hosted software. Thanks for.
Okay.
And thanks for all these questions, especially Philip. And yeah, so AnnoWrap is currently in a soft beta. So we don't have a release announcement yet, but the app is public and can be used. So if you have someone or if you want to use it, we can just tell you how to use it, but it's running live on QDR and on the website. That's in the slide that I will upload.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Yeah, no questions more. Okay, let's move on and go to our next presentation.
Alrighty, thank you.
Yeah, so our next speakers. So it will be Rory McNeil from Rspace. And Rory is CEO and founder of Rspace and leads Rspace team in order to facilitate better science by making it easier for researchers and their institutions to capture, manage, and reuse research data. And he will do this presentation in collaboration with Julie Goldman from Harvard and Maria Rizzelli from Dmp Tool, California Digital Library. So, Rory, floor is yours.
All right, thank you. I'm actually going to kick it off. And so my name is Maria Pratzelis, and I am with the California Digital Library. And we're going to give you a brief overview of a new integration that we just built that passes information about research projects from the planning stage, Dmp Tool, into the active stage in the electronic lab notebook Rspace, and eventually to Dataverse when the data is deposited. So really what we're trying to do is facilitate higher quality and more comprehensive research data capture and tracking throughout the life cycle of research. So we're really working from the planning stage with Dmp Tool, where the researcher is creating their data management plan, submitting it to funders, into the active research phase where they're really collaborating, managing analysis workflows, and working in their ELN. In this case, it's Rspace, into the final kind of stage of sharing, disseminating that information, looking at access through depositing it into a repository like Dataverse. So I'm with the Dmp Tool. I think most folks are familiar, so I won't go too far into it. We are a platform for the creation of data management plans. We're just at 10 years, so we've been working in this field for quite some time. We have over 72,000 users, a growing list of participating organizations across the world at this point. We have templates for all of the major US funders and many international funders as well. So our work with data management plans for the past several years has really focused on the creation of machine actionable data management plans. So transforming the DMP from the narrative format into a structured format that contains information that could be passed to different stakeholders throughout the life cycle. So really the goal is to support the creation and stewardship of FAIR data. So you can see why this integration was really exciting for us, because it allowed us a way to really prototype and demonstrate how the rich information in a DMP could be passed and updated over time through integrating with other systems. So the kind of the glue that's holding this together in making it structured information and that we could pass is the use of identifiers. So we're using the existing DOI infrastructure to pass information from a data management plan into other systems. So one of the first things we had to do as we transformed the DMP was to PIDify it. So basically to transform it from unstructured data to structured data with identifiers wherever possible. So we currently have many identifiers baked into the DMP tool. And as we have additional use cases, we're adding additional identifiers to the tool as we go. This is just a graphic showing you how a data management plan is updated over time. So the purple dot in the middle represents the specific data management plan. All of the folks on the left are ORCIDs. In that ORCID record is also all the rich information that comes from ORCID, like affiliations, publication records. So all of the associated data sets and publications as the project progresses are then connected to the data management plan through identifiers. So we use it as a hub of information to record how a project progresses over time and to demonstrate the link between the planned outputs and the eventual publications, data sets, software, anything associated with that project. So we create that relationship through identifiers. This is useful in terms of demonstrating compliance with upcoming data management or data sharing policy. So a lot of people in this space are talking a lot about preparing for the new NIH data management and sharing policies, which come into effect next year. Won't go into what those policies are, but just at a very high level, NIH is saying that researchers need to maximize the sharing of scientific data. NIH has said they're going to be checking on this. So people are really thinking about ways in which they can demonstrate compliance and make sure that researchers are eventually sharing their data. So this integration, we'll talk a little bit more at the end of our presentation specifically about how we support this. But really what we're trying to do is streamline the workflow so that researchers have a trail and can easily demonstrate compliance with policies such as this NIH data management and sharing policy. So I'm going to turn it over to Julie now, and she can take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Maria. So really building on the work happening at CDL and what Maria just covered, we want to share that seamless workflow from project planning, data collection and storage, and then ultimately data sharing. Ideally, as Maria has mentioned, having the DMP tied to a data set in a repository like Dataverse removes a lot of the barriers researchers face to connect all of their research products together and demonstrate compliance. So I want to quickly break down these three tools, really focusing on the support we offer at Harvard University as kind of a use case for how you may advocate for this workflow. Next slide, please. So Maria already talked about Dmp Tool, but it's a free tool to create data management plans that fulfill requirements of different funders. Many libraries, like Harvard Library, offer support for Dmp Tool and maybe data management plan review and consultation services. Our data management working group, which I presented on yesterday, it's a group of multiple research stakeholders, and we have created templates that include example texts and links to Harvard policies and resources. So these can be accessed when users sign into Dmp Tool with their Harvard credentials. And as Maria just mentioned, the NIH just announced that new policy for data management and sharing. We think these templates will help researchers comply with those funding requirements. Of course, there are other data management plan creating platforms out there, like Dmp Online, for researchers to create documents to comply with other, data sharing requirements. Next slide, please. So we want to quickly talk about Rspace. Harvard has an ongoing pilot with the ELN Rspace. This is a service collaboration between our research computing, information technology, and the library units. You may be aware, ELNs are kind of becoming a standard in research labs. They can serve as a centralized and structured data management system. And we signed on to Rspace because it really enables researchers across disciplines to work together in ways that are streamlined and secure. Rspace connects to other research tools, and we have integrated Rspace into many of our Harvard systems to make, sorry about that. We have connected Rspace into many of our Harvard systems just to make research processes more efficient. I've listed some key features we think Rspace enhances researchers, workflows, and I'm going to let Roy talk more about those connections next. But of course, we want to highlight that you can add DMPs from Dmp Tool directly into the notebook gallery space in Rspace. So that just allows, the entire research team to be able to access the DMP from their ELN whenever they need to either reference it or update it. As we have seen from the NIH, they're, consistent. They're going to be looking at, are there going to be changes made to your data management plan throughout the project funding period? And then, of course, exporting data in a variety of formats, including directly into Harvard Dataverse. So let me go to the next slide and let Rory talk a little bit more about all the awesome integrations for Rspace.
Thank you, Julie. I just assume everyone can hear me. If not, let me know. Yes, I'm just kind of a parenthetical intervention in the middle of Julie's talk. So you'll get back to Julie in a minute, but we thought it'd be useful if I gave you a little bit of an elaboration on what Rspace is. So it started out life as an electronic lab notebook, and it still is an electronic lab notebook. So it's a very fully featured content management, creation, and document management facility, which can serve as a replacement for the classic paper lab notebook. Over the last 6 to 7 years, it's really evolved, and it's become a lot more than that. It's become a research data management engine, and that's depicted in this graphic. So it now consists of 3 core components. One is the electronic lab notebook itself. Second, we now have a fully fledged, very modern mobile-first sample management and inventory system, which is deeply integrated with the electronic lab notebook. So you can now manage your samples and sample metadata along with your experimental data. And we've got a set of powerful APIs that allow things to be built on top of Rspace and allow connections. So conceptually, the whole point about Rspace is connectivity. So this integration that we're talking about today is right in our sweet spot. And again, Rspace is not a data storage facility. It's meant to be a place where you can create content, but also there's going to be lots of other content that is in lots of other tools and other places that people use. So and you do not want to move all that data into something like Rspace, but it's very useful to be able to associate it with the experimental and sample data in Rspace. And you can do that through integrations we've done with institutional infrastructure, as Julie mentioned, things like institutional file storage, so where you may be keeping your big data, like your sequencing data or your imaging data, as well as more lightweight data storage facilities, things like Dropbox, Google Drive, et cetera, where you might be keeping your quote unquote small data, things like spreadsheets or Word documents or the equivalent. We've also now more recently incorporated the ability to bring in more specialist kinds of data, which are more likely going to be found in specialist tools, and associate those with your experimental data. So we have an integration with an animal colony management app. We have our newest integration is actually with Cluster Market, which is quite exciting. So you can now also associate the record of the equipment that was used in an experiment with the experimental data. And one which is equally, if not more, even more exciting in some ways, is with FAMES, which is an interesting, the Field Acquisition Management System, which is funded by the Australian Research Data Commons, which is an exciting tool developed around archaeology and ecology and other data collection in the field. So it enables offline data capture. So you can now also easily incorporate data captured offline into Rspace. So, and then really the first thing that we did and the core of the whole idea is to be able to pass data from Rspace into repositories like Dataverse to facilitate fair principles and reuse and query, et cetera. So that's the final point I'll make before I'll pass back to Julie, is that Rspace is a research tool, and it's already used by researchers. And what we've tried to do through the integrations with Dataverse and now also Dmp Tool is also kind of marry up the research and the research data management and make it a tool that's useful and facilitates research data management, but in a way which is pleasing, hopefully, to research data managers, data stewards, data librarians, but also makes life easier and not more difficult for researchers. And the fundamental point is that the data is in Rspace, it's already structured, it's already there. So with that, I'll pass back to Julie. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Rory. Awesome. So that ties into the last tool or service point, which is our data repository, Harvard Dataverse. This is a collaboration from units across our campus. And with the integration with Dmp Tool, you can associate a data management plan to an exported data set, and that data set will then be connected to that DMP along with all the other project outputs. So really, packaging the entire, grant together in one place. Additionally, Dataverse, as we've been talking about throughout the conference so far, is Dataverse is part of the NIH GRAY initiative, the Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative, that brings together six generalist repositories to supplement that NIH, the NIH domain-specific data repositories, and provide further support for federally funded research. And we think that initiative will be crucial for researchers to comply with the new NIH policy and make their data available where possible with the lowest barrier to access. And we just saw kind of on that chart from Rory that Rspace is working with additional repositories that researchers may want to use. So next, we're going to actually look at a demo of this integration. So we have a video to show you that. So I'll let Maria play that video. Here is a quick overview of the Dmp Tool Rspace integration, which facilitates linking together a data management plan and project outputs with minimal effort. Here I have my list of DMPs in Dmp Tool, and I am recording my research and storing the data in Rspace. I can easily set up the Dataverse and Dmp Tool integrations on the Apps page, enabling Rspace to directly communicate with these services. I can then browse DMPs inside of Rspace. I can filter by my DMPs and public DMPs, and can select which DMP to import. Importing into Rspace will store the DMP as a PDF inside of a separate DMP gallery, which I can easily view, as well as reference and link to within Rspace. Now, here is my research data for this project. I am ready to export my work. This is a straightforward process within Rspace, as I can directly export to an external repository such as Dataverse. I will make an HTML export and provide the information Dataverse requires, being sure to associate this export with the appropriate DMP. After the deposit is confirmed, I can view all of the research data in Dataverse. Most importantly, a direct link to the exported materials on Dataverse is then passed back to the original DMP in Dmp Tool as a unique and permanent related identifier, which supports traceability and fair data. This identifier is also recorded on the landing page for the DMP. This landing page serves as a public-facing page listing all outputs related to this specific project. As additional data sets are published, these citations will be automatically added to the landing page, keeping the research materials and data management plan in sync throughout the research process.
Did you want me to jump in, Julie?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just,
Okay.
I hope that that demonstration video was a good way to see how the three tools work together. It's pretty straightforward process. But yeah, we'll wrap up with some further thoughts on how these three tools can comply with data sharing requirements. Thanks, Maria.
Yeah, so I think, seeing this integration through the lens of this new NIH policy is a good way to understand kind of the motivation behind why we built this. We're looking at the three services and how they work together to support compliance with this new policy. So with the Dmp tool, like Julie mentioned, we have a template for the NIH data sharing policy with sample text and guidance built into it. Users can generate a persistent identifier for their data management plan, and then link that to their outputs so that they have that connection between the planning and sort of the statements made to NIH about what data is going to be generated, and then the actual data deposit into whatever repository they're using. So the active data management is done in this case in ELN of Rspace, where they facilitate persistent identifiers for research objects. The connection between that active work and the data management plan, or the data management planning phase, is connected through linking DMPs with the eventual research data sets. And then, as Julie mentioned, the Dataverse repository does meet all of NIH's desirable characteristics of data repositories. And they are, as she mentioned, an approved generalist repository ecosystem innovation partner. So they're really working together to do this work. So the three services coming together are kind of what we're trying to build that workflow. So I hope we've answered any questions now. I think that was the last slide. So if there's time, I haven't been looking at the chat, so I can.
It was a question from my colleague from Dance about API key. Do you need to provide it to Rspace?
So This integration, you don't need an API key. We had to provide an API key to Rspace, and I'm sure that the same was true between Rspace and Dataverse. But in order to use this, all you would need is an account or a data management plan with an identifier from Dmp Tool, an account with Rspace. And then if you are a Dataverse user, but I think Rory's also opening it to other repositories over time. So yeah, no API keys are necessary for this.
Okay, thank you. And a question from me, what is the license of Dmp Tool, and is it possible to localize it, for example, with GDPR compliance to make it work in Europe?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are totally open source, and we have instances of Dmp Tool all over. We also work with a larger group called Dmp Roadmap. So we have a shared open source code base that we use that is used in other countries. So we've got Dmp Online, which is in the UK, Dmp Assistant in Canada, Dmp Opidor in France. There's others, all sorts of countries participating. So we're working together. So we do all of our development work together. So yeah, if you had local security requirements that, our instance didn't serve, you could spin up your own. And sometimes people do that, especially if they have really strict security parameters at their institution.
And who is maintaining Dmp Tool?
So it's hosted out of the University of California, and we've been hosting that for 10 years now. So that's the home of it. We're not grant funded. We are just supported through the UC system.
Okay,
and really the way we kind of maintain that, because we're a small group, is being open source and collaborating with other teams. So that's how we keep things going.
Okay, thanks. It looks great. This integration is really beautiful. Thank you very much. Okay, let's move on. And our last speaker today is Markus Gardner from University of Stuttgart from Germany. And Markus is a PhD student at the Institute for Natural Language Processing in Stuttgart, and previously he got diploma in computer science with minor in computational linguistics. His research interests include information retrieval and corpus querying. So Markus, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to the introduction to the example project. So since example is solving a very peculiar problem, I'm going to spend some time outlining the legal backgrounds and contextualizing our work here before delving into the interesting technical parts. So example was a cooperative project funded by the Ministry for Science, Research and the Arts in Baden-Württemberg, Germany. It ran for about 2 years and ended earlier this year. Participants were the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology for Legal Counseling, because we dealt with a lot of copyright-related questions. Then the Institute for Natural Language Processing to provide actual real-world use cases and feedback, and the University Libraries in Stuttgart as the infrastructure provider. That's also where our initial link to Dataverse came from, because the University Library is maintaining a Dataverse instance in Stuttgart called Darus. And the problem we investigated and intended to provide a solution for was the sharing and reusability of text corpora based on copyrighted text material under the recently updated German copyright law. And to get into a bit more detail here, the general copyright landscape is very diverse. So looking at it globally, we have various foci ranging from very usage-focused doctrines like fair use to systems that focus a lot on the right holders. Even in other systems like the European Union, there's still a lot of diversity in that regard. And the recently implemented Digital Single Market Directive can be seen as like a small step towards a more homogeneous system here. But member states still had a lot of freedom in implementing this directive. And our focus in the example project is on the German copyright law called Urheberrechtsgesetz here, which at least previously focused immensely on the right holders, and only recently weakened that focus a little bit. In particular, there are two important sections in the Urheberrechtsgesetz interesting for our project. So the 60D, that since only a few years now allows text and data mining for non-commercial research on copyrighted works. Before that, there was basically no blanket permission to do non-commercial research on that kind of data. And it originally contained an obligation to delete text corpora. So the data researchers collected, annotated, and sampled for the project had to be deleted after it ended. And there was an option for archiving within dedicated institutions, such as, for example, libraries. Right in the middle of our project duration, there was a significant change here, which almost rendered our approach obsolete, but it still makes sense in that context. So they got rid of the deletion obligation, but also there's no longer an explicit permission for archiving the still protected research data or the corpora after a project ends. But since funding agencies here usually encourage the teaming up with such data centers or infrastructure providers to provide sustainable storage of the research data after a project ends, those entities still count as like participants in the project, and so the approach is still valid. But either way, there's even with the updated legal situation kind of an unsatisfactory situation after the regular end of such text-based research projects in Germany. Then we have the 60C and Urheberrechtsgesetz, which allows libraries, for example, to give out up to 15% of protected works for non-commercial research. Typically, this means you can go to the library and run up to a certain number of pages in a book through a copy machine, or request a portion of a digital document. There are certain examples of works that can be given out in its entirety, but those are minor exceptions. So there are different aspects of the data lifecycle that are affected by the copyright. So what resources can be accessed for research in the first place? How can they be shared during an active research process? And most importantly, what to do with them afterwards. And this poses a series of issues for researchers. So prior to the copyright reform, there was basically no permission to do proper research on copyrighted text materials. So most of the work, for example, in digital literary studies or similar fields, was restricted to data from the public domain, which could mean sufficiently old text material where there is no applicable copyright anymore. Or if research was done on protected material, the research data often could not be published, which effectively means the FAIR principles are not possible here because the accessibility part is crossed out by principle. After the DSM implementation, we're in a situation where now text and data mining research in a non-commercial setting is allowed on copyrighted material, but still the handling of data after a project has ended is still not solved in its entirety, and is especially in the context of sharing or giving away parts of the data afterwards, researchers are more or less left on their own. And in the past, it was usually solved either in the way of going to the rights holders and negotiating some sort of deal with them for reuse of their data in a research context, which A, is time consuming, and B, can also be very expensive depending on licensing conditions and fees. So considering that a lot of short-term projects don't really have that kind of funding or extra time, it's not broadly applicable. And this can also escalate pretty quickly to large numbers. So one of the well-known text corpora in Germany, so the German reference corpus, consists of a total of over 200 license agreements to make all the parts contained in it available in some way. And also, depending on the license conditions that you negotiate, there might be heavy restrictions on how others can use it afterwards. Other approaches previously were entirely focused on working around the copyright aspect. So you could obfuscate data or only extract certain information from it that then can be freely shared, like extracting text n-grams, or only certain derived information that doesn't allow reconstructing the original data or large enough parts for the copyright to still be applicable. But the nature of those derived formats or extracted information severely limits its usability. So most disciplines in the humanities really need access to the original data in its entirety, or at least in a certain context about the phenomenon in question, to really investigate it and verify it. So while workarounds exist, they're not really applicable to all situations there. And the example approach, on the other hand, takes a different approach. So we combined the 60D and 60C to allow researchers to do their research work on copyrighted material, store them in a repository that is not fully publicly accessible, and then allow interested third parties to access ideally customized excerpts, so up to 15% of the data for verification, or to investigate if some research data actually is of relevance or interest for their own approaches. So they then, for example, can come in and acquire legal access to the data, which can be costly, and then do their own TDM or similar research on it. So to give a high-level overview of the example workflow, we have two different loops here between two groups of researchers and the data in question. And in more detail, the upper loop is basically kind of an ingest phase where researchers do their text and data mining research on some primary data that gets enriched with annotations and metadata, and that is then stored in in this context, a Dataverse instance, and all of those data parts can be very heterogeneous. Inside the project, we focused in our first step on PDF data because that's easier to split or segment later on, and universal dependencies and TEI as as two instances of widely used linguistic annotation formats. And for example, like such tabular annotation similar to UD can look like this, where a text is split in sentences or word tokens and enriched with some form of linguistic annotations like lemmatization, part of speech text, syntactic information, etc., which is of importance for other researchers that want to evaluate that data for their own projects. And the actual example part of the workflow is this lower loop where the second group of researchers express their information need or their interest to the system, and then through a variety of steps get an excerpt of the research data that ideally is of high relevance to their interests, because again, we can only give up to 15% according to the legal restrictions of a given copyrighted set of research data. So it's really important that those up to 15% contain as much as much relevant data as possible for a given user interest. And we also need to keep track of who accessed how much of what protected or copyrighted data to make sure those limits are never exceeded. On the integration part, example is integrated via the External Tools API and is running as a separate service as a file level exploration tool. It's based back on the 5.3 API of Dataverse. So as I mentioned earlier, the project ended earlier this year. So currently it's partly in limbo and until people switch back to it later this year. And from the Dataverse side, it depends on the user's API token and a file ID. I'll come back to the issues on the token dependency towards the end of this talk. And on the technical front, it's built on a similar tech stack as Dataverse itself. So we decided for JSF and generally Java-based backend, since it's highly likely that it would be maintained by the same people or the same team that also runs the associated Dataverse instance. So having a similar or equal tech stack is of a certain advantage here. So, like mentioned earlier, currently the file for the formats supported by example are rather limited, and as entry point, which we will see in one of the next slides, it uses a like metadata or configuration in JSON format to tell the exam to provide a entry point on the Dataverse side that tells the example server where to find a corpus and what to do with it. And for this query part where users express their information needs, we use an in-house query evaluation backend for corpus queries. So starting from a JSON file on the in a Dataverse, the user gets then forwarded to the example server. And so a minimalistic example of such an example manifest could look like this little dummy entry here, which tells the example server what files make up the corpus and some legal information on the right holders, which is required for the excerpt generation. And to keep it minimalistic, I skipped the part down here where there would be information about the actual format and how the annotations are composed. On the example landing page, users could then decide how they want their excerpt to be created. So you could just let the system give you a static part of the corpus, or decide on a flexible slide where you can kind of decide where on the total corpus you want your excerpt to come from. Both of those approaches don't guarantee a high relevance of the returned data. So the ideal approach to maximize relevance for users is the query-based one, where the user input a corpus query, which defines their interests based on the linguistic annotations in the corpus. And then they get a visualization that hints on where in the total corpus the matches are located, maps it on the segments that make up or can make up an actual excerpt. So in the case of PDF files, those would be individual pages. And again, users can then select from this part where or which actual slice they want to get out. The excerpt then consists of the slices of the original data. So for example, PDFs of those documents, the linguistic annotations, like we've seen above, which can be optional, and legal information for the primary data to comply with the copyright requirements. And all of this is then wrapped in a zip archive, and in the background it will be tracked who accessed what or how much of what. So to sum it up, the DSM directive considerably changed how copyright law in Germany affects the research environment. There were still some unsatisfactory parts left. Example tries to solve some of those and provide a prototypical solution. And it's very lightweight implementation directly interfaces with Dataverse and is available as open source. Currently, further development and maintenance there is on hold until later this year. And to just point out a few little caveats or challenges we encountered in the project. So as mentioned earlier, we're using the API token that can be provided to the external tool from Dataverse, and then use that token to access the user info and use the user ID, I think it was, for tracking the quota, which is not ideal because the user ID can be changed, and also the API token, which we noticed later, is not consistently provided for all kinds types of files. For example, completely public files, at least back then in 5.3, didn't get the API token provided. And I see I'm a bit over time, so I'll just skip the other challenges and thank you for your attention, and links to the project page and the implementation on GitHub are available on the slides.
Thanks, Marcus. And we have a question from Philip Kanzet. So do the slices of original data contain references to the original work?
So in the case of PDFs, so the slices itself are just like the raw, for example, in case of PDF, the raw pages, and references or information to the original work is then part of this legal information that's also part of the excerpt. So the slices themselves are really only like a physical slice of the document.
Mm-hmm. And can tool be example can be adapted to legislation in other countries than Germany?
So I'm not a legal I wasn't a legal expert in the project, so I'm probably oversimplifying here. As long as the, let's say, if the framework is somewhat comparable, I'd say yes, but you'd probably have to pose that question to a legal expert in the respective other country.
Mm-hmm. And we have another question from Genevieve Michaud from Sciences Po. She's interested to know more about the TI support.
Okay, so TI is like a family of widely used, somewhat.
It's a kind of XML, if I'm not mistaken, right, Genevieve?
Yeah. So it's like an I can say annotation standard that's emerged in the digital humanities, where you can like have your text corpus in XML with inline annotations and referencing. Inside example, we in DV. So it's only partly supported in the example part. So in one of our use cases in the project, annotations were provided in a let's say TI dialect. So we made a very minimalistic support module for exactly that use case. Supporting TI in its entirety is pretty difficult because there's a lot of variability and customization that projects or annotators can apply.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. And last question from me. So it seems like this tool is very useful. Do you have any plans to continue?
Yeah.
So just you can also speak to James Myers about publishing it in GCC GitHub.
Yeah, so we're definitely we definitely want to continue on it. Like I said, currently it's a bit in limbo because the project ended. I did the main technical part, and I'm currently on a completely different project. But I'll kind of return back to the library later this year, and hopefully then work on the project continues. And long term, we also plan to establish it as a service on our Darus system. But there are still a few question marks. But yeah, we don't want to just let the prototype die, so to say.
Okay, that's really good news. Oh, and we have probably last question. It's not a question, so it's a remark from Philip. So it could be also interest for trolling for Norway service, Norwich service. So you already have plenty of possible collaborators in this work. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and we're getting out of time. So thanks again, and see you next sessions.